Welcome back to CRA Mondays, another episode, another chance to make sense of the CRA together. Here's your first dose of updates, consultations, discussions, and community work that help us all stay aligned and ahead of what's coming. Today is with us Piet De Vaere with a very interesting talk, given the time and effort put on vulnerability handling from many of the people that is in this call. And he will be speaking about when disclosure fails, Europe's struggle with CVD. So once again, Pete, thanks for accepting the challenge. And yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It starts well. Screen sharing has failed to start. Let me try that again. See if I get better like this then. Yeah, I assume you can see the slides now.
Yep, perfect.
Okay, perfect. All right, so thank you, Juan. I am Piet. I am a security or CRA consultant by day, and besides that, I'm also I'm quite friendly with the open source community. And the story that I want to tell today actually has not very much to do with either of those two things, but I want to tell the story of how I found or at the beginning of this year, a vulnerability in my bank's or online banking logging system, and the difficulties that I went through disclosing that vulnerability. Then, of course, this is quite anecdotal, but what I would then want to do in the second part of the talk is actually look at some of the law and policy that shows that what I experienced is actually rather systematic, or at least suggests that strongly. Right. So with that, I'll start by giving an overview of the vulnerability I found, right, which, as I said, was in the online banking of my bank, where when you want to log into online banking, you are first greeted with this screen where you can then select your name, and all that does, it links you to a pre-saved mobile phone number. Right? Then in this field, you can actually type whatever phone number you want, ideally yours. Then you click the next button. And then what happens is that a message is sent to this authenticator app, It's Me, which is very widely used in Belgium. And then the instructions are that you should open this message, confirm with your fingerprint that you actually want to log into e-banking, and then once you did that, you're authenticated and you get access to the e-banking platform. So on the mobile side, on the It's Me side, this looks like this, where initially the app is just idle, no pending actions. Then once you send the login request, you get this request to log into the bank, you get this card. When you tap that, you get this screen where you see a little bit of very basic information about the login request. So you see that it's with the bank, you see the time, and then you just see what data is going to be shared with the bank. And then at the bottom, it's a little bit hard to read in this picture, but you have a nice green button that says confirm, and then you have a gray button that says reject. And if you press the reject button, or if you press the reject button, nothing happens. But if you press the confirm button, then you confirm with your fingerprint. And after that, automatically the banking app or the browser session is logged in. This is a very simple login flow, but it turns out that it's actually quite flawed. And to the people in this call, I'll maybe give you 10 seconds to think about if you can already see where this could go wrong. So basically, the problem with this is that if you have an adversary that somehow submits a login request for the victim's phone number and manages to time that login request just a little bit before the victim does its login request, for example, because the adversary is shoulder surfing, or because the adversary calls the victim and says like, "Hey, I just wired you €1,000. Can you please check if that money already arrived?" So just triggers the user to go through a normal login sequence. Then what the user will do is they will also do the normal login sequence. They would go to the app, they will tap login, they will confirm. But then what will happen is, because there are two simultaneous login requests, the first login request will actually be handled by the app before the second one. So in this case, what would happen is that the adversary is logged into the e-banking rather than the user. And at that point, the user is probably a little bit confused. But computer systems screw up from time to time, so probably not particularly worried. What's more, if they look in the app, they would see that there's still a login request there. They probably just assumed that something fluked. They'd confirm that login again, and this time they would log in their own session. And then what makes this such a problematic flow is that in all of this, or in this entire sequence, really the only indicator to the user that something is going wrong, right? That tells them in this step that they are about to log in someone else than themselves, is that there is this little 2 here above this card, which indicates that there are 2 login requests happening simultaneously, right? But that's, in my opinion, it's not a very self-explanatory symbol. It's also not something that you typically expect to see. So I know, at least for myself, if I would see that, I would probably not pay a lot of attention to that. Additionally, when you're logged into the bank, there is nothing that shows you that there's 2 sessions running simultaneously. There's nothing that tells you when the last session was logged in. So really, besides this 2 and the fact that you'd have to tap twice in the app, there is nothing that shows a user that this attack is going on. And then I think this is quite an interesting vulnerability, because also when I realized this, I was also thinking, this vulnerability, it seems to be so fundamental and in your face that it almost, you almost start doubting if it actually is a vulnerability, and arguably it is a little bit disputable. But thinking about this more, what you really see is that, in my opinion, there's a design vulnerability here where this login flow has 3 major flaws. So the first one is that there's no binding between a browser session and the authentication request. And so when you're a user and you're tapping confirm in the app, you don't really know what you're confirming or which session you're confirming. And then there's also no authentication of the user in the browser, right? So there's no password that needs to be typed in there. And when you look at similar systems that are being used, you see that they really all have at least one of these 2. And so either you bind the session in the app with the browser session, for example, by scanning a QR code in the browser, or you need the user to enter already a strong first factor in the browser before then there's the second factor in the app. And then the third flaw is that, well, even though there is this little indicator here, I'd argue that actually in practice, the user is not informed about the concurrent request, because that to the vast majority of users is meaningless. So once I found it and I talked to some people, and I really convinced myself, okay, this really is a problem. What I wanted to do is I wanted to report this vulnerability, and both to the bank, but also to this provider of the login service. And I started by looking for the CVD policy of the login service, which, if you're not from Belgium, this is actually this is a pseudo-government online ID or digital ID that's very heavily used in Belgium by all sorts of government, government services, all sorts of banks, insurance companies, etc. It's actually a very high-profile service. I found out that they did not have a CVD policy, and I also did not find a way to contact them. I learned later that there was a web form hidden somewhere, but I did not find that. And then for the bank, I did find the CVD policy, but it basically said, okay, if you want to report the vulnerability to us, you have to do this over this integrity platform. And when I went to this platform and I wanted to create a report, I was a bit surprised, because I saw, okay, I couldn't just do that. I had to create a user account. To create that user account, I had to verify my email address. I was a little bit annoyed by that, but I did it. Right? And I thought, okay, now I can submit my report. But then actually I got faced by a second hurdle, where it said, okay, if you want to report something to this bank, before you can do so, you need to have your government ID verified by the integrity platform. Right? And at that point, I was like, okay, I don't really feel like doing that. I don't think that's proportional. I don't trust them with this data. And additionally, it felt really disproportional, because the CVD policy of the bank also said that in no circumstances can you make anything related to the investigation public, unless to the extent required by the law. And then the program on the integrity platform also said this is a responsible disclosure program without bounties. So this all felt extremely one-sided, where there's no bounties, you're effectively agreeing to an NDA, but you also need to have your government ID checked. So I didn't want to do that. But what I did instead is I did a little bit more Googling, and I found, first of all, that the bank had an email address for their CERT. Then I also found that there's a Belgium national CERT, which anyone can also report vulnerabilities to. So what I did is I wrote an email to both the bank and the CERT, and I said, like, dear bank, I'd like to report the following critical vulnerability in your online banking system. You can reach me on this email address or this phone number. The affected systems are your online banking, It's Me, and potentially other web services that use It's Me, because again, this is a very widespread service in Belgium. And then I briefly described what the problem was. I said the outcome is that the attacker gains full access to the victim's online banking environment, and there's really no technical skills required. And then I had made a proof of concept video of this. I had put it on YouTube as an unlisted video, and I sent them the link to this. You also see this structure in the email is actually because I used a template provided by the Belgian National CERT. Then I think I reported this on Friday or on Saturday. Then a couple of days later, after the weekend, I got a first response from the National CERT. They wrote, "Dear Piet, thank you for your report and for your interest in contributing to cybersecurity improvements." So far, so good. After reviewing your submission, we would like to inform you that the organization involved, the bank, has its own dedicated vulnerability disclosure policy in place. According to the CVDP law, if an organization has such a policy publicly available, researchers are required to follow the procedure outlined there rather than reporting the issue via the CVDP, where the CVDP is the national CSERT. You can find the official disclosure guidelines for KBC here. Additionally, we noticed that the proof of concept video associated with your submission currently has over 30 views. Please be aware that KBC's responsible disclosure policy explicitly states that you should not make anything public. And in the light of this, we highly recommend that you remove this video until you've coordinated directly with KBC and received their explicit consent. Signed by the Cybersecurity Center for Belgium, the CCB. So when I received this email, I was a bit unhappy because, well, it seemed like they were not actually engaging with the thing I reported. I also discovered later that some of the statements that they were making here are actually incorrect, but I'll get into that in a bit more detail later. But basically, I responded to them that I did report to the bank that if I really want to follow the CVD policy of the bank that requires me to verify my ID, that I didn't want to do that. I pointed out that this vulnerability, it involves It's Me. That's a very important piece of Belgian digital infrastructure. So maybe you want to look into this, see if there's anything or any other entities involved. I told them this YouTube video, it's just an unlisted YouTube video. I shared it with a couple of friends. It's not like trusted friends to get their opinion. It's not a very long video, so they probably just watched it a couple of times. That's how we got to 30. Then I also looked at the law. I told them, like, okay, this thing that you're saying that I'm not allowed to report to you, that's not actually what the law said. Come back to that in a second. And then I told them actually twice, actually, because this was over 2 emails, let's actually, instead of doing this meta discussion, let's actually look at the problem at hand here. Right? But then the response I got to that was they wrote, the matter has been referred to our legal department, right? As part of a longer email, which initially the way and the context it was in, I received as at least somewhat of a threat. I learned later that it was just somewhat unfortunate communication where I had cited some parts of the law, and the techies that were responding to this email, they didn't know how to deal with that, so they forwarded the matter to the legal department. But then they also basically kept insisting that also this unlisted YouTube video is still considered publicly accessible. They also pointed to some Google documentation, which I didn't really get. But somewhat ironically, they seem to be claiming that just having something at the URL, or you need to know the URL to access it, that is not a strong enough access control mechanism for this kind of information. At that point, I was quite annoyed. So I responded. I was actually quite annoyed, so I responded just with an email with a rolling eyes emoji, which was a bit unprofessional, but I think also not overly aggressive. And then I was like, okay, this is not going anywhere. I thought of other things I could do. I realized that I actually had the head of the Belgian CSERT as a contact on LinkedIn, so I messaged him. I said, like, hey, maybe we should really look into this. Then the people at the CSERT, they didn't actually look into it a bit, but then they said, oh, we cannot reproduce it. And then I said, well, actually, I can reproduce it in this and this environment. Whatever kind of dodgy stuff I throw against it works. If I try an adversary on the Tor network and a legitimate session in my trusted browser with all of the cookies and in a known state, it also works. So it just seems like that works. But then in the end, they basically just told me like, hey, please provide us with a full written report of your findings. And they didn't specify what that meant. And then if I didn't feel like writing a full written report because, well, felt like that was a bit much to ask. But I did tell them again, like, look, this I can really reproduce this. But basically, they stopped responding to this. Throughout all of this, I heard nothing from the bank. But then 2 weeks after my last email to the national CCERT, I wrote another email again to the bank and the CCERT, where I said, it's been 2 weeks since I last heard from the CCERT. Clearly, you don't really consider this to be an issue, so I assume that I can make this information public. And that actually caught the bank's attention, where they responded by saying that the information provided was already known to us and assessed with due care. So they were kind of suggesting that they didn't think it was a problem. But then they also provided a bunch of references saying that I was not allowed to make this public, etc., etc. Things I had already gone through with the CCB, so I responded to them, showing like, no, actually, this is not what the law says. But instead of engaging with that, like I just got another email from them where we're again saying like, we don't see an issue. But still, they said you are not legally permitted, nor do you have a legitimate interest to disclose these findings. Again, because also they were suggesting that this unlisted YouTube video was a public disclosure. And they said, if you would do so anyway, then this could be considered an incitement to commit IT crimes, which suddenly becomes a fairly clear legal threat. After this, I realized that this was not going anywhere. I tried a couple of other things, none of them worked. So at that point, I basically just let all of this rest for a bit, until then at some later point, something else a couple of months later triggered me to kind of pick this up again. So that's kind of my real world experience. The first part of the talk. And what I want to do now is actually look into what does Belgian law say about this, what does European policy say about this, and what went wrong either in what the CCB did, what the bank did, but also is the law actually any good? So in Belgium, responsible disclosure is covered under the Belgian NIS2 implementation, which already at the case of the incident, Belgium was actually one of the very few countries that has transposed NIS2. And there's 2 articles in there that are relevant. There's Article 22, which basically appoints the CCERT as the national CVD coordinator. And it says very clearly that any person may report a vulnerability to the CCERT, even anonymous if they want. And it says that the CCERT is responsible for ensuring that the vulnerability is properly followed up on. And here, this is interesting because you see that both of these requirements were violated, because the CCERT was actually telling me that I was not allowed to report to them. I had to report to the bank. There's nothing to that or about it in the law. And then also they clearly did not ensure that the vulnerability is properly followed up on, because they kind of stopped looking at it. They didn't respond. And I have or as far as I know, they've also never looked if any other systems were affected as well. And then there's Article 23, which creates a safe harbor for reporters, for CVD reporters, which says that as a CVD reporter, you can get legal immunity for a set of computer crime laws if you are acting in good faith, if you do not disclose or disclose your finding without consent from the CCERT, if you inform the affected organization and the CCERT within 24 hours of discovery, and then if within 72 hours from discovery, you follow kind of a proper procedure and inform the CCERT and the org in full. And there also they say, like, if the organization has put up any procedures for how to report to them, you have to follow them. And this law or this article, even though it clearly comes from a good, or the idea on a high level is good, and it's actually quite problematic, because here in bullet 2, no disclosure with consent from the CCERT, that gives the government an insane amount of power about which kind of information is disclosed and which is not. And in theory, you could say, okay, well, the CCERT can serve as a good neutral entity for that. But in practice, and this is something that someone else found out, is that it looked like the CCERT, they were just not approving anything. And especially, given that the CCERT is also linked to the state, and it's, there might be vulnerabilities in there that the state has an interest in using. I believe this is quite problematic. And then bullet 3, there's this 24-hour deadline, which clearly mirror some of the language that you find in NIS2 and in the CRA, and I believe also in the GDPR, which in those cases makes sense, but here doesn't really make sense because you're imposing this very strict timeline on somebody that is effectively trying to do an organization or society more broadly a favor by giving information about a vulnerability. And so this 24-hour deadline is, first of all, it's very tight. And second of all, you cannot really expect everyone that comes across a vulnerability to know about the existence of this law and this requirement. And so, and the way that the law is formulated, that would basically mean that you cannot get any legal immunity. And then the fourth bullet, so you have to follow the procedure outlined by the affected org. That's also problematic because it gives so much power to the affected organizations that you get cases like exactly what I dealt with, where they're really forcing you or trying to force you into to follow a whole bunch of arbitrary kind of steps and jump through an arbitrary number of hoops that they put up. And you can say, well, if you don't do that, you don't get legal immunity. And then, so that makes that article problematic. What then was also problematic is that both the bank and the national CSERT, they did not recognize that you might not need legal immunity. Like in my case, it was very clear that I did not do anything that could even theoretically be illegal in finding this vulnerability. Just for the proof of concept, I logged into my own e-banking using 2 browsers in parallel. I didn't do anything that was illegal. And this argument where I said, well, I don't want any legal immunity, so I don't care about Article 23, that's something that neither of them want to engage with. So in general, I'd say that this law, even though it comes from some good intentions, it's actually fairly problematic, particularly Article 23. So that's the Belgian level. I also found a very interesting document on the EU level, which is this document by the NIS Cooperation Group, which is a group that consists of the member states of ENISA and the Commission. That is kind of a formal group that's created by the NIS and its 2 pieces of legislation. And they have this policy or this guideline on implementing national coordinated vulnerability disclosure policies. And if you look at the legal mandate that this group has, you can pretty much say that whatever is written in that document is de facto the EU policy of how these things should be done. And in that document, you will find this definition of CVD policy. It's quite long, but I'll read it nonetheless, where they define a CVD policy as a formalized set of rules for searching for and reporting vulnerabilities, with an emphasis on coordinated handling of information about these vulnerabilities in order to limit the damage caused by unintentional or untimely disclosure or by non-responsive counterparties. These rules should provide a guarantee that the entities involved in the process will not disclose vulnerability information without due coordination. And at first sight, this policy or this definition might seem quite close to what a CVD policy is actually supposed to be. But when you look at it more, like there's a bunch of subtleties in here that are actually problematic. And so the first one for me is this notion of a set of rules for searching and reporting vulnerabilities, because it strongly indicates that it's rules that are being imposed on the reporter by whoever wrote the CVD policy. And then also there's this notion of provide a guarantee that entities involved in the process will not disclose vulnerability information. So that also really strongly hints that you should actually have some of these NDA style statements in your CVD policy, as also the bank had it. And when I look at this, and when I look at some of the other language in this document or other similar documents, I find the following logic in there largely, where whoever wrote this stuff, they assume that if somebody has a vulnerability that they want to report, they must have somehow abused the system in order to find that vulnerability. So they must have done something illegal. Therefore, for them to be able to report that vulnerability without facing legal consequences, that is a privilege. And therefore, you can subject them to a formalized set of rules which dictate how they must behave. Okay. And when you think of all of this from the concept of finding vulnerabilities in services, I think it's already a flawed assumption, but it makes some sense, right? Because services are typically run on a system that whoever is testing that service or interacting with that service, or that makes that they might do something that they not have strictly speaking permission for. And I know that in many countries, computer crime laws are kind of written very broadly, and there are many things which, in my opinion, shouldn't be illegal. which theoretically are. So in that setting, this makes a little bit of sense. But under the CRA, but even also under NIS2, CVD is not only about services, it's also about products. And when you think about products, this really makes no sense because a product is typically owned by whoever is also probing that product or trying to do something with that product. So it's very unlikely that somebody did something illegal to a product in order to like even theoretically illegal to a product to find something, find a vulnerability. Just kind of want to reference this where in NIS2 and CRA it talks about CVD. When you look at the NIS2 Article 12, it says the CSERT designated as coordinator shall act as a trusted intermediary, facilitating where necessary interaction between the natural or legal person reporting a vulnerability and the manufacturer or provider of the potentially vulnerable ICT product or ICT services. And so you already see, even in NIS2, there's already a focus on products. And then in CRA Article 13, that entire law is about products where services in the form of RDPS are more of a secondary item. But in the CRA, it just says that manufacturers shall have appropriate policies and procedures, including CVD policies, where you see talking about manufacturers, there's clearly a very strong focus on services. On products. So clearly, all of this is quite flawed. But then, at some point, well, actually, I think what's in NIS2 and the CRA, what's in there is pretty solid. But then everything that sits below that appears to be quite flawed. And what's interesting is that, when I was looking into this more, and at some point I wrote a blog post about my my experience, and I got in touch with the Belgian CERT, also with KBC eventually, and with ITSME. And then, when talking to the people that were involved in this and that were on the other side, so both the people that wrote the policy, but also the people that were interacting, you actually notice that what they are trying to do is for a very large extent also just really comes from good intentions. Right? So I noticed that both talking to people involved in drafting the Belgian law, but also talking to CERTs across Europe that are represented in this NIS-CG, that this definition actually comes from good intentions, where the main idea, and this is even listed in this CVD policy document from the NIS Corporation Group, is that by treating a CVD policy as a set of rules, you're effectively treating it as a legal contract, which means that if reporters, if they follow those conditions, then you have some legal ground to stand on to say, okay, you can actually not sue those reporters, right, or those researchers. And I think in principle, that's a good idea, but where it goes wrong is that both the Belgian law and what happens in this NIS-CG document then actually takes that a step further, and they are actually then using some of the power that they have from this legal threat in order to force the behavior they want from reporters. Right? So effectively what you see is some sort of legal coercion, which in my opinion is very disrespectful towards reporters. And also doesn't work when there is no crime or no theoretical crime that the reporters did. Right? If they're not afraid of legal consequences, then you won't be able to coerce them with those legal consequences. And especially now that we'll see a stronger focus for CVD from services towards products, that will be problematic, or that will be even more problematic than it currently is. Then, all of this, it also creates quite a strong power imbalance towards the affected organizations, so in favor of the organizations that wrote the CVD policy or the government, which when you look a bit at almost every other vulnerability disclosure story, you notice that actually the reporter needs to have some leverage in order to get organizations to actually address the vulnerability and to do so in a somewhat timely manner. And so if you then, in these legal instruments, if you start to really skew the power towards the affected organizations and the government, you just notice that it just makes it easier for those organizations to ignore the vulnerabilities, and that's not very good, or that's just plain bad for cybersecurity in the union. And then finally, I believe that this entire approach, it really undermines the history and spirit of CVD, and where we used to come from more of a practice of full disclosure, then as security researchers, as reporters, there was this realization like, okay, actually this is not particularly good. It's not particularly responsible. So what we'll do instead is we'll move to responsible disclosure, where we're still using that thread of disclosing a vulnerability, but we'll still try to work with organizations to give them a chance to fix this vulnerability first. But knowing that we are in principle allowed to do this disclosure. And what you see in this legal framework, in the law, and also in this document, is that it's really trying to take responsible disclosure and CVD, which really was supposed to be something where reporters are trying to do or to act on their social responsibilities, and they're basically turning it into a mechanism that can be used in order to get reporters to shut up. And then there's one more very interesting aspect to this, and that is that none of or many of the things that I said right now that don't make any sense for a CVD policy, they actually make a lot of sense when you're looking at the bug bounty program, right? Where you really see that this NIS document and in my opinion also the Belgian law, it really conflates the concept of a CVD policy and a bug bounty, where in a CVD policy, this is relevant when somebody has found a vulnerability. And once somebody has found a vulnerability in your system, you really, and they're willing to tell you and to help you, you should make it as easy as possible for them to do so. Whereas under a bug bounty program, which is an active invitation towards anyone to look for vulnerabilities in your system. There, this is de facto some sort of contract, like it's basically some weird form of a pen test that you're buying. And there it makes sense that you can set, as an organization, you can set some rules of engagement for that reward-based research. And when you look at a bunch of these problematic things that I mentioned, such as mandatory identification of reporters, NDA clauses, also scope restrictions, where some policies will say, you can only report, or the CVD policy only covers this part of our system, but not this part. None of this belongs in the CVD policy, but it's all perfectly fine in a bug bounty program. So, what I have done, and this is really just the first proposal, and it definitely requires some further work. Thinking, okay, if I would need to write this NIS2 or this NIS cooperation group document, and I need to write a definition of a CVD policy and a bug bounty program, what would I do? So, and then I thought I would define a CVD policy as a public commitment by an organization to receive and handle vulnerability reports in good faith, offering assurances that reporters acting responsibly will not face legal threats, while committing to investigate reports, communicating transparently, and coordinate disclosure timelines in order to reduce risk and protect users. And so it's really something that it's a statement from an organization that says how they will behave when they're confronted with a vulnerability disclosure, but it doesn't put any restrictions or requirements on the reporter. And then in this NIS-CG document, a bug bounty program is called a reward program. And there's a definition in there that I think is also flawed. So there I propose this alternative, where a reward program, such as a bug bounty or recognition scheme, is an optional incentive mechanism that may exist alongside but never substitute for a CVD policy. It sets out the scope and conditions under which researchers may look for and report vulnerabilities in a system or product in exchange for monetary or non-monetary rewards. So I'd like to propose these two definitions as starting points for a discussion after this talk. And then I also want to bring up a couple of other questions more related to CVD and FOSS, where I think it would be very valuable for us as a FOSS community to think, okay, what can we actually do to support CVD in Europe and to make that successful? And how do we interact with national CERTs, when they get reports or vulnerabilities in our code bases, or when we, through our development work, we find a problem in some other code and we report it to them, like how can we make that go constructively? But also then how can we support manufacturers, governments, and various other operators to turn disclosures that they receive into upstream patches in our software, right? Because that, in the end, should be the goal. So those questions, I want to thank you. And yeah, I'm hoping we can have a bit of a discussion on this.
Thank you, Piet. Great presentation. I think that, yeah, instead of waiting for our questions, you brought three really good ones. Salvi is asking if your presentation is going to be shared. So this is up to you.
The slides, I think it's
Yes.
recorded, so I can share the slides as well. Yes.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So, well, you made one of the questions that I have for you. Which is well, one of the questions that, and I don't know if anyone wants to ask something first. I have at least one, maybe two questions that I would like to make. Maybe I can start with the first one. One of the main challenges for the open source community is basically to identify what is the CERT that yeah you need to interact with. Especially if it's one of the projects that you are hosted, you are yeah, maintaining, and you are not based in Europe, but yeah, you are following under CRA rules because your project is yeah, is currently implemented in products that have been launched in Europe. How do you see this? Or do you see any potential, like clear path to, well, basically sort this challenge that we have ahead of us?
So I'm kind of thinking out loud that if it's unclear which CCERT is the best one to contact, maybe it would make sense that this is a task that ENISA takes, right? We have software that does not really have a clear manufacturer in the EU, and that because I know that somewhere in the CRA there's like this long list of or this couple of steps where if you're making a product, you're placing it on the market, but you don't have representation in the EU that you can use to decide which CCERT is applicable. I believe that will not work for open source software that's not placed on the market. Maybe that's a case to say that this is something that ENISA handles. Or maybe, as we've seen with, for example, the CVE ecosystem, maybe there will just be naturally one of the CSERTs that will emerge as a topic leader on this.
Good. No, I think that the NISA is one of the candidates I heard, and yeah, that probably makes sense. I saw Daniel's comment in the chat. Daniel, do you want to share it?
Sure. Hey, everybody. Hey, Pete. Thanks for the presentation. I mean, there was a situation, I think it happened about a year and a half ago. Can you hear me anyway?
Yep, we can.
Okay.
Yes.
Something's weird with this video. Maybe it shows up, maybe not. Anyway, um, there was a group of students in the ICT department of the University of Malta. I feel like this was a year and a half ago by now. And their advisor, adjunct professor, something like that, was teaching them about ethical hacking. And they discovered in an app for students basically open APIs and were able to get public information. I don't know if they changed anything. Stories differ a little bit, but they contacted the CEO. And this kind of comes back to your question, how do we support manufacturers and governments? They contacted the CTO, and as college kids sometimes do, they maybe used a couple phrases that could have been interpreted to mean extortion. They said something to the extent that normally for this kind of disclosure, they'd get some money. And obviously the CEO of this tech company, this app or whatever, panicked and reported it to, first of all, the data commissioner, which is the person or the entity in the Maltese government responsible for GDPR and data protection. And he was like, nah, there's nothing here. What's the big deal? And then he called the police and the police are like, oh my God, there's been a hack. And the kids got arrested. All of their devices got confiscated. Their professor got arrested. His devices were confiscated. And even though everybody in the world knows that this was like not a hack, they've still been charged with no, I'm not like I don't know if it's like a felony or a misdemeanor or how it's really going to be classified in Malta. But here's the problem. These kids, these 20 somethings, they I mean actually adults, but these young people from my aged perspective, they have a serious problem. They are not going to get hired for cybersecurity roles that require a clearance because of these charges, even if they're dropped, right? And so, I mean, yes, I agree with the spirit of the question. How can we support them into turning disclosures into upstream patches? But I feel like it's even more important to recognize that this kind of activity, when done more or less in a decent way, doesn't turn people suddenly into criminals and ruin the rest of their lives. I mean, if you're interested, I can dig out the original emails because I'm in touch with them, with the students. Obviously, they don't really like talking about it much these days. And, um, you know, anyway, I just thought I'd share that story of how this stuff can have real human repercussions. You think you're doing something right and then end up getting strip searched.
Yeah, I think so. I read about this case, and I recall reading the Wikipedia page, and I'm not sure. I think that was not a good source for that, but it also said on the Wikipedia page, after this happened and after it hit all of the news, they saw that the number of vulnerability disclosures in Malta kind of dropped with a double-digit number. And so it really shows how these kind of experiences or how these kind of stories end up making society less safe because people get reservations from reporting. Similarly, in Belgium, eventually I wrote a blog post about my experience with the bank, but that was triggered by someone else who wrote a blog post that was suffering from some similar problems, and who also just said, like, look, in this country, because of the way that the way that the government is acting and the way that the law is written, it's just not safe to do vulnerability disclosure. So you probably don't want to do that. And so we already see, both in numbers, but also in just the message that people are spreading, we see how this actually leads to less vulnerability reports, which is exactly what we don't want. Right? And then I do believe that reading somewhere that in the Malta case that the kids, they received like some grace, or they were exonerated by your top government person, whoever that is. So that's interesting, but it shouldn't have to come to that, right? It shouldn't have to be like a national kind of news story. And yeah. And then another thing which I also experience is that I mentioned, when I was having these interactions with the CERT and the bank, there are definitely many things that I could have done better. And I think also in some of the communication that I've had recently with them, I've been on purpose, sometimes quite strong. But I would argue that as an organization that's receiving these reports, it's also your obligation to, or you should be able to handle these kind of cases, right? Because you cannot put these responsibilities on honest citizens that just want to do something to help and that actually do not have malicious intent. Talking to the bank, they also mentioned that sometimes there are cases where there are people with malicious intent, they're trying to masquerade and they're trying to do these kind of extortion things. I recognize that's a problem, but clearly, just from the stories that we hear, we're not finding the right balance there.
Yeah, any other question or comment? I think this is a pretty interesting topic that maybe we should explore other ways of keep discussing it, because yeah, it has multiple angles to take the discussion. But yeah, for today, if anyone want to make another question. If not, I would say a huge thanks to Pete, because I know that he made a huge effort today. So I really appreciate your talk, your time. Of course, we'll keep in touch in different spaces. And yeah, thank you all of you for your participation during the CRA Monday today, and we'll keep in touch. Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you.